Our host today is Cam Caldwell, Director of Nonprofit and Philanthropic Partnerships for Socrata. Cam is joined by Jim Burch, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Police Foundation, and Lamar Gardere, Chief Information Officer for the City of New Orleans. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and we encourage your questions. Just use the Send Question to Staff feature in GoToWebinar, and we'll answer as soon as possible. So again, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. Cam?
Thank you very much. Great to have everybody here. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are. Socrata is very happy to host this webinar on open data and public safety and some of the motions that are happening out there in the public sector. I'm very pleased to present Jim and Lamar, both experts on kind of what's happening at the local level with the police departments and the release of data. We should have a very lively discussion. We're going to go for probably the full hour. We're going to do 30 to 40 minutes of presentation, and then we will open it up for Q&A at the end. If you have questions during the session, go ahead and submit them. There should be a submit a question button on your GoToMeeting panel. Submit them there, and we will feather them into the conversation. And then there'll be a section at the end. So we'll go ahead and get started. I will say that if you have colleagues that are having trouble getting in, we have a huge response to the webinar. So we are bumping up the number of slots for folks to join. So if you've got folks that are having trouble joining, we will get them in soon. If we can't get them in soon, we'll make the webinar available and or do another one. So we will accommodate everybody that wants to hear about this. Just jumping in, we've done some introductions, talk about what we're going to do today. I want to talk a little bit about the Police Foundation, and I'll introduce Jim here to give a bit of background about the Police Foundation and the work that they do and the goals of that organization. Jim, are you on the line?
I am. Great.
Yeah, so maybe tell us a little bit about what the Police Foundation is all about.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. Thanks, Cam. Again, this is Jim Burch with Police Foundation. I'm the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives here. And I'm happy to tell you a little bit about the Police Foundation, which is a national organization. A lot of times when we talk about the Police Foundation, people think that we're speaking of a police foundation that may exist in their state or their city. This Police Foundation was created 45 years ago as an independent nonprofit organization. We're not a membership organization, so we don't have a membership per se. We were created specifically for the purpose of improving policing through science and innovation. Believe it or not, this is our birthday week. Tomorrow marks the 45th year of our existence. The Ford Foundation announced on July 22nd, 1970, the Ford Foundation announced the creation of what was called the Police Development Fund, later renamed to be the Police Foundation. For those 45 years, what we have been involved in is a lot of scientific experiments related to policing, but also a lot of innovations and program development type activities. So specifically for those who have familiarity with policing, when the Police Foundation was created, one of the big questions that existed at the time was how should police patrol communities? And do we need to be more reactive, or is there a way that we can be out in the communities and prevent crime by being in a more of a preventative patrol mode? And so the Police Foundation did led a scientific experiment on those questions, and that is one of the historic studies that the Police Foundation has supported. And it really changed the way police interacted with community through the patrol function. We've done similar studies and similar initiatives around the issues of foot patrol and how foot patrol can be more effective. And then more recently, we've done a lot of work in the issue of hotspots, how to address hotspots for crime, as well as studies related to shift work. So police agencies use a number of different shifts. Some are 8 hours, some are 10, some are 12, and some are compressed. Which of those shifts work best? So we've done research into all of those areas. But we don't just do research. Science is a part of our mission. Innovation is another piece of our mission. And so we're currently working on a number of developmental efforts related to technologies that have the capability to be disruptive in a good way to public safety, specifically how virtual reality, for example, might play a role in improving policing. We also may look at information technology developments or GIS type developments. And we also want to look at best practices. So what's happening out in the community today that we can take an example from somewhere on the West Coast, for example, and share it back with a department on the East Coast or multiple departments in the Midwest. That is essentially our role. The reason why we're engaged in open data is because we believe that it has great potential to enhance transparency and trust, but also to support data-driven architectures within police agencies. As police agencies become more data-driven, the use of open data both internally and externally to promote dialogue with the community we think can be very valuable.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jim. And kind of you mentioned the rise in the use of data within police departments and the concepts of open data, and that's a good lead-in to the police data initiative, which is a new initiative that's come on the scene in the past few months here. Maybe talk us through a little bit about the origins of it, where it came from, and maybe what some of the goals are.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do it. So as I think many people who follow policing, who are involved in policing know, over the last year or so, we've been watching the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing do its work of holding hearings around the country to understand from a variety of perspectives how we can improve policing. They came up with many recommendations as a result of that task force. And if you read that report, I think there are a lot of words that jump out at you. One of the words that jumps out at you very clearly, because it's almost the first word in many paragraphs throughout that report, is the word trust. And so really what the task force is saying, in addition to making a lot of recommendations about operations and training and those kinds of things, is that we need to really redouble our efforts in building trust with our communities. And so consistent with that, on May 18th in Camden, New Jersey, the President made an announcement there about the Police Data Initiative. And the Police Data Initiative essentially has really two components, if you think of it that way. One is more external facing and revolves around the issue of open data and using open data to increase transparency, build community trust, and to support innovation, as I've just talked about, which is the Police Foundation's interest. It really is about departments sharing disaggregated data about police-citizen interactions, specifically in machine-readable formats. So in April, in anticipation of the launch of the Police Data Initiative, the White House convened a little over 20 different law enforcement agencies to talk about how the Police Data Initiative should be formed and what it would do. And at that meeting, those agencies committed to a total of 101 data set releases. That is, in conversations with those agencies, they each identified a number of different data sets that they said, we're already releasing now in a way that's not open. We can easily convert that and release this data in an open format. And so that really is what sort of the momentum that brought about the Police Data Initiative. There is a second piece to the Police Data Initiative that focuses more internal and around how agencies themselves can improve their own accountability within the organization by using data in more proactive ways. But the focus of the Police Foundation, and I think most of us on this call today, is really around open data and policing, or the external focus. I think it's just really important to mention, though, and I'll touch on this again in just a minute. One thing that the Police Data Initiative is not, it's not a centralized database. And so there's not any part of this initiative that involves the White House collecting data from local law enforcement agencies. That's not what this initiative is about. The initiative is very much about local law enforcement agencies releasing data that they believe is appropriate to release within their own communities.
Thanks a lot for the background, Jim. That's a great overview of the origins of the Police Data Initiative and what some of the high-level goals are and what it is and what it is not, to your point. In terms of the activities and the actions that are taken by the participants and the founding members of the Police Data Initiative, maybe walk us through a little bit about what some of those activities are and some of the actions that are happening.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So one of the most exciting things that I've seen happen as a result of the Police Data Initiative is the formation of a community of practice. So these agencies, which now, by the way, has grown to 24 agencies and many more inquiring about the Police Data Initiative, are now participating in a group, a community of practice, to work together to share best practices and ideas. And so one of the purposes of the Police Data Initiative, or objectives I should say, is to find, share, and encourage innovative work that's already taking place around the country. So for example, Cincinnati right now is leading the way in releasing open data around citizen complaints filed with the Cincinnati Police Department. It's one of the first to do it. They've got a Socrata portal there in Cincinnati, and I believe they've got a data set on their portal that provides that information. They're one of the first to do that. And so they may be a great reference point for other agencies around the country that are asking, how can we do a better job of being more transparent around citizen complaint data? They may look at Cincinnati. Or if another agency is interested in being a little more interactive in how they release crime data or incident data, for example, they may want to look at Los Angeles County. And so this community of practice will then point them to LA County, where they've done a particularly innovative job using the visualization tools that are available through Socrata to show their crime incident data. So it has that way of sharing best practices and bringing people together. It also serves as an opportunity to bring the city and county leaders together with some of the top technologists, researchers, and data scientists to collaborate on ideas and solutions. So, you know, in many ways, in the life of life of local government, these people pass each other in hallways. They may participate in meetings. But this initiative specifically is a way of bringing them together into a room to say, how can we work better together to come up with new ideas and new approaches to be more transparent using open data? The Police Data Initiative, I think, also aspires to support community-based events using open data. That may be a hackathon, for example, or it may be bringing together a group of people in a community to test out a new idea with open data. And I think I learned something from Lamar this morning about something particularly innovative they're doing there with their open data in the community. I'm sure he'll talk a little bit more about that. And then last, I think, is to create the platforms, resources, and mechanisms to share best practices. That really is the community of practice. And I should point out that the International Association of Chiefs of Police is one of the enabling partners in the PDI. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but IACP in and of itself is a massive community of practice, being the largest law enforcement association that is participating.
Yeah, we've noticed definitely at Socrata a lot of activity on different fronts, you know, from our customer base at the local level especially, and just a lot of conversations that are being facilitated, that are started from interest in this Police Data Initiative, and it's been quite interesting to see it and follow what's going on you know, across the country. Jim, as the Police Foundation, as one of the foundational members of the PDI, what's the role of the Police Foundation moving forward in setting up the Police Data Initiative and the functions that the Police Foundation will take?
So I think part of, well, our role as an enabling partner, obviously, is to support the local agencies and the CIOs and CTOs that are participating in the PDI. And so we take part in the weekly, what we call stand-up calls which the White House Innovation Fellows participate in as well. We participate in the community of practice. We recently went out to Seattle and participated in the body camera summit that the Seattle Police Department hosted there. Another role for the Police Foundation and the initiative is to encourage more law enforcement agencies to consider the benefits of open data. And so what we did earlier this year was we published a document in a series called the 5 Things series, and it was about open data. So the 5 things you need to know about open data in policing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the purpose there was to encourage more agencies to take part in releasing open data. I think ultimately what we want to do is we want to be in a position to launch a meta portal that would pull together links or data sets that are available through the PDI, open data sets. What we'd like to do is to be sort of a one-stop shop, and at the same time providing access to those data sets that you could get locally one at a time, or you could come nationally and see all of the agencies that are participating and access their data. But with the help of Socrata and Esri, we want to do is showcase that data and to provide some context with it. We want to be able to tell a story, and that's a big piece for the Police Foundation in our role of encouraging people to understand what policing is and what policing isn't. We want to be able to tell that story and add that context to the data, and that's what this national open data portal or meta portal will aim to do. And then also, as I mentioned, just continuing to participate in the community of practice and to share those success stories across jurisdictions, highlight them on our portal once it is ultimately launched, and to do so within the community of practice.
Great. Thanks, Jim. That's a fantastic background and overview of the PDI and kind of what's happened to date. I'd like to shift gears now a little bit and talk with Lamar Gardere about what's happening at the local level, in particular the city of New Orleans, and really thinking about the role of open data kind of historically in terms of public safety and how that's informed the work that New Orleans is doing with the police data initiative. And Lamar, maybe you can tell us a little bit about New Orleans' history there and your decision to adopt a policy of open data in terms of public safety.
Sure. Thanks, Cam. This is Lamar Gardere. I'm with the City of New Orleans, the Chief Information Officer here. And our decision to move into public safety with open data kind of has to step back to 2010 to really understand how we got there. It's another one of those things that was really driven by Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath of that. In 2010, when this administration came in, we were dealing with one of the nation's toughest blight problems. There were 30,000 to 40,000 pieces of property that were blighted that needed to be remediated in some way. And we had made a commitment that we were going to deal with 10,000 of those by 2012. We started our process of remediating those properties. We also found that as a result of that disaster, we had a highly engaged group of residents and citizens here who had taken it upon themselves to recover from that disaster. It was that bootstrapping that really allowed the city to recover in the way that it did. And 5 years in, there was still a lot of work to do. What we found, though, is that as we progressed along our path of remediating blight, and citizens went down their own path of recovering their neighborhoods, there was a natural tension that formed. Residents had some goals for their neighborhood, and the city, in some cases, had data that could help them, or rather, residents thought that the city had data that can help them. Frustrated that they couldn't get that information from local government, they began to create their own information about parcel layers and property conditions, and they were swapping their own hand-drawn maps and things like that. Poor man's it was really a poor man's GIS system at that point that residents had created on their own. At that point, we created something called BlightStat. It was an open community meeting that allowed residents to come in and talk to city leaders about the process of remediating blight, including any of the data associated with that. At some point, there was a real tension for us to provide that data to folks, which is when we decided that the best thing to do would be to open that data, make it publicly available, and we did that through a Socrata portal. For us, it's data.nola.gov. We started first with low-hanging fruits of information that we had readily available that we knew folks were really clamoring for. We released that data, and immediately the conversation changed. It went from being adversarial to being one of cooperation. Instead of residents being upset with us for not having visibility into various processes or not having status updates and as quickly as they would like, the conversation turned to how can we help? We see this out there and it's missing in your data. How can we help fill in some of your gaps? That was a surprise for us, but a welcome surprise. Since then, we've grown to about 200 data sets with about 200 more coming online this year. So when the invitation came to participate in the public safety version of open data, because we already had some experience in it, we were ready to head into that with our eyes wide open and eager.
Yeah, thanks for the background on that, Lamar. I think that the example of open data in relation to the blighted properties in New Orleans really resonates with some of the goals of the police data initiative. In particular, you know, that feedback loop between citizens and local government, really opening up that conversation and that dialogue, which is really one of the core tenets of the police data initiative. And in the efforts to date in New Orleans with blighted property and open data in general, there's been a lot of effort that's gone into the release of data. Love to hear maybe some of the benefits that have come out of open data in New Orleans. Absolutely.
As mentioned, that feedback, that back and forth is, I think, one of the positive benefits of opening that data. That's that continual feedback from the community that we're able to get through programs like BlightStat. We have a stat program that happens actually every Thursday for different areas of city government now, all based on open data, all giving the community an opportunity to come and talk to us, hear what we're saying about progress, show the data, and then have a dialogue, an honest dialogue about what we believe to be true and what they believe to be true out in their neighborhoods. It's been a great back and forth. Because we've done this, we're able to say confidently that open data does work. It actually does create a conversation with your community. It does create trust. It does create a more open and honest back and forth. There are some other benefits, though, beyond that. First, there are the apps that can be created if you make that data openly available. Through Code for America, we had an experience where the folks came in and built an app called Blight Status. Blight Status is a tool that anyone can use. It's an open source tool now that anyone can use to track the remediation process of a particular piece of property, which was really just what our residents were asking for. We've got that. We've got an Open 311 Explorer that depends on the Open 311 data that we're actually going to be releasing pretty soon. At the bottom of the screen here, we see a map for something called roadwork. New Orleans, as a result of the hurricane, has an unprecedented amount of construction going on right now. That's resurfacing roads and streets and sewer line repairs and things like that. Obviously, that creates a certain headache for commuting here in the city. So what we did was, based on the open data that we had out there, we built an app called roadwork.nola.gov that gives citizens the ability to see what sections of roads are closed at any given time, what project does that belong to, how much did that project cost to do, where does the funding come from, how long is that project going to be going on. and when are future projects coming up, so that you're able to have some visibility, some idea about when the construction in your neighborhood is going to start or end. Obviously, most folks are more interested in when it's going to end. One of the other good outcomes here is your ability to respond to freedom of information requests. Like many other cities and police departments, we're inundated with requests for information. Once you put that data out there, make freely available, instead of filling that request, you're able to simply point to the data portal and ask for folks to grab the information from there. It saves a ton of resources, administrative resources, in terms of filling those requests. At the point that you put data out there and you're able to have conversations, there's an automatic increase in transparency that people experience. That's been one of the great outcomes for us. We've been committed to transparency from the very beginning, and the open data portal is where we actually demonstrate that transparency on a regular basis.
Right. That's great. Lamar, one of the important pillars of an open data program is policy. You know, what policy a city or a county has on the release of data. Maybe walk us through a little bit about New Orleans' current policy and future thinking about open data and public safety open data in particular.
Right. So because we jumped into this so early, we're a little behind on creating the policy. We're now catching up in terms of policy. What we're working on now is, or rather working from the concept of being open by default. There's no need to spend a long time contemplating whether or not it should be open. If the data quality is good and the data set makes sense to open, then it's open by default. Start your conversation from there, and it's easier to get that kind of effort moving. You can't have that conversation, though, without a data governance committee, a group of folks who have been appointed by leadership to discuss data issues and make recommendations around whether or not a data set is sufficiently of high quality, or if the cost to open it is burdensome or it can't be sustained in a certain way. That data governance committee is able to make recommendations on that. You can't make a recommendation on what you don't know you have, so you absolutely have to take it upon yourself to create a data inventory. It's a huge task to gather up all the data in a city, but it's absolutely one of those things that you have to do as you're approaching your open data goals. Otherwise, you're not sure what you have and what's the right priority in which to open data. Lastly, you want to have a way to evaluate a data set to determine if it actually makes sense for you to open. And what you see below is a sample scorecard that we use to evaluate data. It scores the data's quality. It scores whether or not we have a solid reason for opening the data. Is there sufficient interest in it? Will anybody care? Is there economic value and opportunity to it? Will it increase transparency? And then we look at the cost of opening and maintaining that data. And by that, I don't mean monetary cost. I mean the level of effort. Is it something that we can easily do, easily get to? And if it isn't, is it such that the data is so valuable and so important that we need to take it upon ourselves anyway to open it, even though it's got a high cost to open? These elements are what's going into our policy formation.
You know, Lamar, as I've kind of led Socrata's efforts around the police data initiative and how we can help our customers, privacy is something that comes up, you know, very frequently. It's one of the first things people want to talk about when they talk about release of police data. How is New Orleans thinking about these privacy concerns?
Right. So privacy, I think in the onset, it seems like it's going to be one of the more difficult issues to deal with. The truth is that it isn't that difficult. You generally know in the data set what elements constitute some sort of private or sensitive data that shouldn't be released. If the data needs to be there to help tie data sets together, but it's sensitive in some way, then you apply anonymization techniques to it to make that data something that can't be used to identify an officer if that's not what your police department wants to do. Sometimes it makes sense to aggregate data. A good example of that is back to the Bright conversation. Sometimes we would aggregate data at a block level as opposed to the address level, so that it's not possible to identify specific people and what their particular issues are at their personal address in some cases. So aggregation sometimes makes sense to provide the appropriate level of privacy. Often you want to ensure that open text fields are appropriately redacted. There's some automatic redaction techniques that we've been able to apply around Social Security numbers and things like that. Another technique is simply excluding some data columns. If a data column has maybe an officer's name or other identifying information or name of someone who was pulled over during a traffic stop, and your police department determines that that's not something that you want to put out there, you simply exclude that data element, that column, from the data set. And lastly, you want to, in some cases, you really want to challenge the notion of what is private and what isn't. I think in some cases, there's a long-held idea that something shouldn't be communicated or given out freely, but there actually isn't any reason outside of maybe history or a political reason why that data can't be made private. A simple example that is interesting here in New Orleans is making decisions around releasing our employee phone directory, honestly. There was a lot of pushback about it because people felt like their cell phones and numbers were private information, but the truth is it's all public information and part of your job to have that information out there. So challenging the notion of what should be private and what shouldn't be is also part of how you get over your privacy concerns.
Yeah, that's great. Those are great things to think about for organizations that are just getting started releasing some of this data. Lamar, you know, as organizations get started in releasing some of this data, I'm sure they're thinking about why are we doing this and how are we going to know if we're successful. And from New Orleans' point of view, what does success mean for releasing public safety data, and how will you measure it?
Sure. We have an Office of Performance and Accountability here that seeks to measure all aspects of how well city government operates. But this is one of those initiatives that doesn't easily lend itself to measurement. It's not measured by the number of data sets you release or number of apps that are created. In some cases, success is much more intangible. It is being able to change the tone of a certain debate so that you're able to work with your residents instead of there being confrontation. Often achieving more by being able to be in conversation with each other. An interesting thing that we stumbled over is that when you make a data set open, you almost automatically improve the quality of the work behind that data. Meaning that once someone knows that it's going to be open, on the back end, the person entering the data is more vigilant about the way they enter that data, is more diligent about doing it often, so that it is correct and timely because people will see it, which means that your operations automatically improve in terms of data collection and doing the work according to established processes. That's been a really great outcome for us. We saw that in the Blight conversation, in other places where we've open data. As we've begun to work through police data, we've immediately seen that outcome as well. In some cases, investigations hadn't been fully entered into the system, but the moment that people knew that it was going to be made publicly available, there was a scramble to update all the data and fill in where there were some gaps. And that's often a positive outcome that you may not see ahead of time. It is very difficult to measure, but absolutely improves the way you run your organization. A couple more things. In some cases, you'll have established reports, UCR reports or ComStat data that you scramble to create and organize and process each month. If you are executing your open data effort the right way, you actually can have those reports created dynamically when you need them, instead of having to create them each month, which is obviously something that improves efficiency of operations. Lastly, we have an early warning system that we're federally mandated to implement here. The open data that we create is something that feeds directly into that early warning system, allowing our officers, our supervisors, to make informed decisions about interventions that could be the difference between an officer having a positive experience with a resident and a negative experience with a resident. Each one of these are different factors contributing to success, all rather difficult to measure, but certainly positive outcomes of an open data effort.
Yeah, Lamar, this is great. I love the example that just knowing that data is going to be seen and used downstream leads to higher quality data by the producers of that data. I think that's a really great, in some ways unexpected outcome. In what other ways has, and that leads into my next question, in what other ways has releasing open data improved operations in New Orleans?
Yeah, I guess I jumped ahead of myself a bit, but absolutely, when you know that the data is going to be available to everyone, you look at your processes, you make sure that you're entering data consistently, you look at your applications, you make sure that that application is able to validate entries so that you don't have things like a start date for an incident that's maybe before the actual incident occurred. Things like that would lead to problems otherwise. Knowing that it's going to be open and working to that end goal causes you to have higher quality in that way.
Right.
It also means
sorry, go ahead.
It also means that in some cases you're reimagining what your business processes look like so that you're able to have a reliable, sustainable data supply chain. Once you put the data out there, you have to keep it up to date. Some of the go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Lamar. That kind of leads into this next topic about the the processes and the data chain in releasing some of this data, which I think it may have jumped ahead on this slide a little bit, but I think it addresses what you were talking about.
Sure. So it's going to be different in each area, but for us, working very closely with our data stewards and data owners was and has been and is one of the key elements for us. That meant that our city IT department and our police department had to work very closely, had to trust each other, had to be more cooperative than I think we had been challenged to be over the history of our two organizations. That was a great outcome. That started out to be one of the first things that had to be in place for us to really make something like this happen. The next thing you have to do, once you're on the same page about what you're going to do, is study and improve those data supply chains. Understand where your data lives, where it's coming from, what some of its challenges are, where business processes need to be improved to make sure that that data stays in a healthy state. It's important to have a data governance committee who is able to help vet and make good decisions about when data should be made available, how often it should be made available, with what frequency should it be updated. Those kinds of decisions that tend to be the difference between a successful release and a release that gets stale and maybe loses the interest of the public over time. Especially as it relates to police data, we found it to be important to provide context for the data that's being released. For us, that means creating a separate website that specifically talks about your data, describes what it is, describes what it isn't, and provides some guidance on how it's used, where it comes from, and what it pertains to. That context for this data is very important. Remember, the effort here is not around being able to count crimes. It's around being able to accurately describe the effort, the act of policing. You want to make sure that you set that context ahead of time so that people know that that's really what it's all about. Lastly, what we've done here is we've decided to vet our data sources, our first data sets with trusted community stakeholders through data preview events. When we started to look at the data, we found some inconsistencies. We found some problems. We found some things that we thought might be of concern. We also wanted to understand how people would react to having this data publicly available, especially as there's so much turmoil across the country related to how police departments are relating with their residents. We really wanted to understand what the reaction was going to be. So we decided to pre-release our data sets to a trusted group of folks who were able to give us reactions without political agenda, talk about what inconsistencies they found, talk about where there were duplicates and why, which gave us a great opportunity to really understand what our data contained before we made it available to everyone.
Yeah, and that was a really great program that happened recently called Operation Spark in New Orleans, where the police chief was very involved, and there was a hackathon, and that was a great way to preview some of the data. In terms of Lamar, you mentioned a dedicated website to create context for the data. That dovetails nicely into a question back to Jim. Jim, you mentioned a police foundation portal that you're standing up around public safety. Maybe tell us a little bit about your plans for that site and what some of the goals are.
Yeah, it really does tie into what Lamar was just saying about the importance of context and the conversation that takes place around policing. And so what Lamar was talking about was very much about the conversations that take place in New Orleans. And I think what our portal is designed to do is to help provide that context for conversations that take place at a national level. And so, what we would like to be ideally is the one-stop shop for people to be able to come and see what law enforcement agencies are releasing open data in what areas, whether it be calls for service data, incident data, complaint data, assaults on officers data, or other kinds of data. As I saw on Lamar's slide talking about community policing and recruitment data. It can be really anything, and our job is, I think, to promote that story about how law enforcement agencies are really extending their efforts in terms of promoting transparency and ultimately building trust with the community. So we want to highlight that transparency. We want to, as Lamar said, add the context that tells that story and provide visualizations that help people understand what policing is all about. Because so much of what people think policing is driven by what we read on social media, unfortunately, which is not always correct, or what we see on television, which is certainly not correct most of the time. And so we think providing this sort of fact-based context at the national level and showing what agencies are doing to try to increase and improve transparency with communities, I think sets a different tone in our conversations about what's going on in the law enforcement community. There's some great things that are happening, and we want to showcase those things. We also hope that by bringing this data together on a national level, or at least pointing to what agencies are doing around the country, that it will help generate ideas and solutions that we may not have had before. And so this idea that people in the community may have a different take on the data than what the agency has had in the past or what our analysts have had in the past, that may be incredibly valuable. So that's an outside-in perspective. But it may also be that providing this open data gives the agency a totally different perspective. Or even better, what if we had technologists or developers access this data and come up with solutions to solve some of the toughest problems that we have in public safety? And so these are some of the things that we're hoping could happen as a result of the agencies pushing out this data locally and us sort of aggregating that and pointing to what they're doing from a national level.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jim. So for the cities and counties that are out there, you know, getting started on this journey of data release, police data release, what are the most important things to consider and to know about?
So I think, you know, I think to me, the publication that we released back in the spring called 5 Things You Need to Know About Open Data and Policing really summed it up very, very well. Bottom line is citizens can see things that we often can't see in our data, so it's important to help give them access to it. And there's evidence of that. If you go out and you look at people that have used the law enforcement open data, they've found things that we haven't found. Some of them may not pan out, but they're all worth considering. Certainly releasing open data promotes dialogue between the agencies, the local government, and the communities, and that's an important thing I think we all agree with. It demonstrates transparency, which ultimately will help us earn the trust and the support of the community in addressing the problems that we see. You know, law enforcement has often said if people could see the things that I see every day, they would feel very differently about the job that police officers do. This is that opportunity, I think, to provide people a way to see and visualize what's happening in their community, and hopefully will generate some additional support for the very difficult job that law enforcement has. I think public safety can also help us in solving some of the bigger problems. So I think one of our goals is ultimately to see if there's a way to bring together public safety data with public health data, for example, and look at some of the more difficult problems that we've had to face in our communities, be it substance abuse, homelessness, whatever it is. Let's see what bringing the data together can do for us. And then last, I think, as I mentioned previously, opening this data can help technologists and developers and other innovators create tools and solutions that we may not have thought of before, and help us solve some of the most difficult challenges that we face.
Thanks, Jim. That's great. I've got your next slide on here about what data should be made available, which ties in nicely with a question that came in from the audience, which is, in your opinion, what's the most important data set for police agencies to make open immediately? So that's a question that's kind of addressed in this slide. So Jim, maybe you could tell us a little bit about kind of where to get started, and then another question on top of that was, are there any standards? Are there any public data standards that have been adopted yet, if any, and what are they?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question very much depends on the local context. There may be things going on in a community that may very much determine what an agency should release first. But absent any of those precipitating conditions, I think, you know, generally I think you want people to know the facts and the realities of the work that's being done, the services that are being provided every day. I mean, this is in some ways no different for police than it is for other types of government services at the local level. So in some sense, any data that provides facts and provides a view into reality, I think is a great place to start. Denise Ross, one of the Presidential Innovation Fellows, recently had a blog post that Code for America and others carried, where we talked about starting with low-hanging fruit. And from my own experience in a federal law enforcement agency, you know, that's exactly what we did. When we started in open data, we looked at what data are we already releasing, be it in our annual reports or through some others, in our case, congressionally mandated releases of data. We were publishing those reports in a PDF format, which were ultimately not very helpful to the people that we're working with in this instance. So we then took that data and took those spreadsheets and simply converted them into an open data format, in this case using Socrata as our portal. It was very easy to do, and the data had already previously been published. So that is really low-hanging fruit, and that's a great place to start.
Have you seen any grassroots type of standards being developed in this space, Jim?
Not in terms of which data sets to release first. I mean, if you look at the PDI, Police Data Initiative agencies, and you kind of scan what data is available, I think probably the two most prevalent data sets are calls for service data, or CAD data, and computer-aided dispatch data, and incident data, which generally comes from a records management system, or RMS. Those seem to be the two that most agencies have put out first. Although, as I've mentioned, the Police Data Initiative, I think, is encouraging agencies to release more information about police-citizen context, and we've seen Cincinnati do that with being the first to release data on citizen complaints, and I think you'll see more doing that. But we're at such early stages, I don't think there are any standards at this point.
Yeah, but I mean, what I've heard folks say is, focus on the release of data. It's likely that the standards will emerge eventually, but the most important thing right now is to get the data out there.
Right, and sometimes the consensus standards, if you will, are the best standards, and that is the standards that result from the actions that agencies are taking around the country, as opposed to someone else bringing them and imposing them in from the outside. We're certainly not in a position to do that here, nor would we want to do that. We're certainly happy to provide guidance to agencies, but I think, as I mentioned in starting out and answering this question, I think the local context really matters in terms of what you release first.
Right. Lamar, from your perspective in the city of New Orleans, what's your take on this concept of getting started, putting one foot forward, and working with the release of police data?
Absolutely, the concept of grabbing low-hanging fruit is the right way to go. You want to look at data that you're already putting out, but maybe it's not in a machine-readable format. Maybe it's in a PDF or locked away in an HTML table of some sort. You want to free that data, make it machine-readable, and have it be your first data sets that you make available through your own portal. That's a way to easily jumpstart your effort. We think it makes a lot of sense to listen to what folks are asking for. We did a hackathon with at-risk youth here in New Orleans. They had the opportunity to preview our data sets, and they were able to tell us what was right and what was wrong about that data. It also helped us to understand what else we need to release to make those initial data sets a little more clear or a little more useful. So start with your low-hanging fruit, and then listen to your community about what's next.
Yeah, and I've got kind of on the screen here, I've got some data sets that New Orleans is focused on, use of force, metadata about camera recruitment and professional development data. So those are some examples.
Right. We also added in there 911 calls for service and our 311 calls for service, and we're excited that our police chief wrote his first line of code during this event. It was NOPD.show records 1000. His first line of code. We're excited about that.
That's pretty cool when your police chief is writing code.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So Lamar, one question that I've got a lot is the challenges around the release of data. To me, they fall into two camps. One is the political challenge of the release of this data. I mean, it's a big step for a lot of police departments to get this data out there in the public eye, really for the first time in a lot of cases. And the second challenge is the technology. Having the processes in place to get data out there, to clean it, to make sure it's been redacted when appropriately, to get it out of the source system in which it sits and out into whatever open data solution you have. For New Orleans, I'm curious, which one of those has been a bigger challenge?
Right. So interestingly, the political piece wasn't the most challenging piece. We have an administration that's very focused on transparency, very serious about making sure that residents are able to see and understand what we're doing and be able to vet the data that we are basing our decisions on. Our police chief immediately suggested that use of force and field interview cards should be made available, even though those are sometimes problematic data sets for some police departments to want to open. So that transparency that transparency initiative for us made the political piece of it a little easier. The technology is actually the more difficult thing for us. And what I mean by that isn't investigating what application the data comes from, but it is the entire process of cleaning that data, making sure that it's high quality, analyzing it, creating a data supply chain, making sure that there are data stewards and data owners in place that will maintain the quality of that data and have it be updated through a portal, hopefully in an autonomous way, so that it's refreshed on a regular basis and continues to be valuable to people. Sometimes maintaining that data supply chain in a consistent way can be one of your most challenging things. Unfortunately for us, the politics part was made relatively easy, so we just are working on technology now.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for that walkthrough. That's really interesting. I'm sure every city has different challenges politically there, but it's great to hear about New Orleans' approach. So we're gonna wrap up here. We're kind of gonna end right on time, so that worked out nicely. Thank you so much to everyone that participated in the call. We had well over 200 participants on the call, and hopefully this was informative. And a very special thanks to Jim and Lamar for participating in the webinar. We've got some contact information on the screen here, and I believe this webinar will be up and available on Socrata's website, and you'll be able to play it and send it to your colleagues, and they can watch it on demand.